In 2018, Snapped killer couples told the story of Rebecca Keller and Carrie Murphy, a young couple consumed by obsession.
The obsession with being in love with each other drove them to do one of the darkest things that I can ever imagine.
There was a total of 74 stab wounds inflicted. It was a vicious, brutal crime.
Currently serving a 60-year sentence in the Texas Department of Corrections, Rebecca Keller opens up about her relationship with Carrie Murphy and the night that changed her life forever.
I may have made a mistake, but I'm where I need to be. But this would never have happened if she had never mentioned it. I was hoping she would have second thoughts about it, but she didn't. All I could just do is just hit my knees and cry. I let her control me and manipulate me.
She can't fully accept that she played an equal part in this.
That jail call was as good as a confession.
I just wish that I was strong enough to walk away. I wish I could take that back. She was trying to say that it was my idea, but as long as the truth is out, that's all that mattered. My name is Rebecca Keller, and I decided to do this to get my story out, to be able to help other women. In a split second, your life can change, and you can't take anything back. And it's a lot of the regret that I have from that night, from that mistake. I can't change it, I can't make it better, I can't fix it. All I can do is keep moving forward and know that in the back of my mind, in the bottom of my heart, I am sincerely sorry.
I think they were living in a fantasy world. They really thought they were going to commit this crime and get away with it and live happily ever after.
July 16th, 2012. At 1:07 a.m., 911 dispatch receives a frantic call from 16-year-old Carrie Murphy.
She told the 911 operator that someone had kicked in the back door and that she then heard her mother screaming and that she ran out of the house.
She had fled the scene to the neighbor's house. So the dispatch and first responders treated it as an active break-in at that time.
When I arrived on scene, I made contact with a female who was identified as Carrie Murphy. She told us that it was someone in the home attacking her mom. Upon getting to the backside of the house, I noticed there were 2 windows of the house that were broken, and the door was open. I made entry into the home and cleared all of the rooms, and at that time came to the bedroom where Carrie's mother was laying. I just saw there was a lot of blood and the victim was laying crossways of the bed. I couldn't tell at that time what the injuries were. I checked to see if maybe she was still alive. I did not feel a pulse.
When paramedics arrive on scene, they confirm their victim, 47-year-old Marianne Murphy, has succumbed to her injuries.
There was a total of 74 stab wounds inflicted to her whole body. Blood all over. It was a vicious, brutal crime.
Investigators arrive and begin processing the crime scene.
Everything that I saw suggested that she was asleep when she was attacked. I could right away rule a robbery out because there was nothing that appeared to be missing. Also, an intruder is not going to stay there long enough to inflict more than 70 stab wounds. So that in itself told me that she was a target of this. The sole motive was to go in there, kill her, and leave. It had to be somebody that was mad at her and wanted her out of their life. This was someone that knew the victim.
Marianne Allen was born and raised in Houston, Texas.
Me and Marianne were raised on the north side of Houston. We both attended MacArthur Senior High School. I graduated in 1981, and Marianne graduated in 1983. When she graduated high school, she went to work for the Department of Public Safety, and that was her whole life. She loved her job. I guess because people would call her and they always needed help, and she was there to help them. She was just a good person.
In the mid-1980s, Marianne's brother introduced her to his friend, Don Murphy.
They started going out and eventually ended up getting married.
They decided that they were going to start having babies, and that's when she found out she was pregnant with Scott.
6 years later, Marianne and Don welcomed a baby girl named Carrie.
Marianne was a very good mother. She was a very loving mother. She loved her kids dearly and would do anything for them.
It was, in my eyes, the typical American dream childhood. They embarrassed me, to be honest with you, because they were the husband and wife that would hold hands and, hug each other.
We always said that it was the perfect four. It was the perfect family, Scott was good with his sister.
Carrie knew that she could talk to me about anything. She and I had a very open relationship. She was very driven with extracurriculars. She wanted to play sports. She wanted to be in the choir.
We were in choir together. She was shy when you first met her, but then once she opened up, she was pretty funny, liked to play around, liked to joke around, have a good time, that kind of thing. Rebecca Keller was, at the time, in choir, and Carrie just kind of fell head over heels for her. The friend group accepted Rebecca and Carrie's relationship.
In 2012, with her 2 children doing well, Marianne was ready for the next chapter in her life.
She was knocking on her 30-year retirement. She was very, very proud of her kids. We couldn't do any wrong in her eyes. She wanted to just make sure that we were happy. I wish I could rewind time and this never happened. I worked the graveyard shift. July 16th, 2012, 1:04 a.m., I get a phone call from my sister's phone. She says, Scott, someone broke into the house. My mom's dead. I dropped everything I had in my hands, and I started to panic. I called my father to let him know that he needed to come home, so he started heading this way.
At the crime scene, investigators take Marianne's daughter, Carrie, aside for questioning.
Carrie told me that she had been up in the dining room scrapbooking, got tired and went to bed, and wasn't in her bedroom very long before she heard a crash. And she said that someone had kicked in the back door, and that she then heard her mother screaming. She ran out and called 911 from across the street. She stayed with some witnesses who let her use their phone. She stayed with them until the police arrived, which was only a couple of minutes later.
The detectives had me place Carrie in the backseat of my patrol vehicle. She didn't ask if her mom was okay, and that to me kind of sent up red flags. She didn't seem to have the emotion of someone whose mom was attacked. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't crying. She didn't appear to really be upset. She was more calm than anything. I didn't know for sure what had taken place, but I had a feeling that in some way, Carrie was connected to what had happened at the scene.
When you're young, you don't really think about things. You just act on them, but later on you regret them. It's the last night of her mother's life. I remember Carrie telling me that she was scared. We both were really scared to carry on with this.
Coming up, the investigation takes a turn with a shocking admission.
To have someone confess to a murder that they didn't commit is manipulation at its finest.
And horrifying new details of the murder come to light.
She was screaming, telling me to stop, and I couldn't.
In July of 2012, the Harris County Sheriff's Office is investigating the stabbing death of Mary Ann Murphy after her 16-year-old daughter, Carrie, called 911 to report a break-in at their home. While deputies escort Carrie to the station for questioning, authorities continue processing the crime scene and discover several concerning clues.
In the bedroom, we noticed that the blood was starting to dry and starting to coagulate, which would indicate that she had been deceased for a longer period than the time that was stated. I noticed that there wasn't any damage to the back door, and there were 2 windows just to the left side of the back door that were broken. When you break a window from the inside, the glass falls to the outside. And when you break a window from the outside, the glass falls inside. And I noticed that one window had been broken from the inside, and the second window had been broken from the outside. So from my observation and looking at the scene, it appeared that someone had staged a break-in. From the call and what was stated from Carrie about a break-in, it would appear that Carrie wasn't telling the truth.
Realizing he'd been to the Murphy home before, Officer Fred Hooper offers investigators the name of Carrie Murphy's girlfriend, Rebecca Keller.
Months before, I was dispatched to the home, and I spoke with Mary Ann, and Carrie was on scene, as well as Rebecca. And Mary Ann told me that she didn't want Carrie involved with Rebecca. She was very upset that she's asked Rebecca several times not to come to her home, and she insists on coming anyway. So at that point in time, I arrested Rebecca and transported her and charged her with trespassing. And being that I had arrested Rebecca at that scene prior to the incident, I gave her name to the detectives when they arrived on scene as possibly a person of interest.
An investigator travels to Rebecca Keller's house to speak with her later that morning.
The investigator, he came to my house and we had sat in his car and I did a statement. Growing up, I was the youngest out of 4 kids. So, mom and dad always busy. I was into a lot of extracurricular activities growing up. I was in choir. I had, a lot of friends.
Rebecca says she befriended Carrie Murphy about 2 years earlier.
We were in high school. I was a senior, she was a freshman. We met in choir. Carrie, her heart, her spirit drew me to become friends with her. We may have been different ages, but it was a lot more easier to lean on somebody like her. We were actually out at the mall with my best friend and her best friend. We all had like a little friend date for my birthday. So I think that's when the feelings for one another transpired to pursuing a relationship. She was the first one that I was in a relationship with a woman. Me and Carrie, we decided to come out and put it out there. One day in choir, being young, you were like, you think that everything is important, everything like revolves around this person. We were very much in love.
Mary Ann Murphy, however, was not so keen on the budding romance between her daughter and Rebecca.
She didn't agree with the age difference between Carrie and Rebecca. She voiced that opinion very, very often and very bluntly.
It wasn't about the fact that her daughter was seeing another girl. It was the fact that I think Mary Ann knew that Rebecca was not the best influence.
Carrie would sneak me in her room at night while her mom was asleep and her dad would be at work. And I guess we had fell asleep. Her mom had heard a noise or something and caught me in the room. The second time that she caught me was when both me and Carrie were in the shower, naked. That's whenever her mom called the cops. They arrested me, took me to jail.
Were there challenges in your relationship with Carrie?
There was a lot of challenges. She lied a lot. Just small, simple things like who she got a text message from, who she was on the phone with, who she was meeting up with. After she had lied to me so many times, I started pushing her away.
After learning more about the couple, investigators asked Rebecca when she last spoke to Carrie.
She's acting like she's forthcoming, that, we liked each other, we tried to have a relationship, but it didn't work out. And that's been about a month and a half ago. I haven't talked to her since then.
When investigators question Rebecca about Marianne Murphy's murder, the 20-year-old is adamant she had nothing to do with it.
I said I was over at a friend's house when all this was occurring. So he took down my statement, he left.
While authorities work to verify Rebecca's alibi, investigators turn to Carrie Murphy and the inconsistencies in her initial statement.
The timeline doesn't match. There was some dried blood on her, which signaled time passage. We know how long it took for the deputies to get there and go inside and find your mother. That would have been within minutes after you said you heard your mother scream.
With permission from Carrie's father, Don, investigators sit down with the 16-year-old for a formal interview.
When she's pressed by detectives for details about the timing of events, the fact that there was no forced entry, she then begins to switch her story.
Out of nowhere, she said, okay, well, there is somebody by the name of Zane. That was the very first time we heard the name Zane. We wanted to talk to him.
"16-year-old Carrie Murphy has just implicated a person named Zane in the murder of her mother, Marianne."
Zane was a friend of Carrie from school. One of the things that Carrie told us was that Zane had a crush on her. She wasn't interested in him.
He was kind of a shy guy, wore, big baggy pants, chains, more of like the gothic emo type, but he was very quiet.
I grew up with Zane. He was kind of a weird kid, but he was a good person.
According to Carrie, 2 days before the murder, she asked Zane if he could help her after she was caught sneaking out.
One night, Carrie's mom caught Carrie outside.
Carrie Murphy's lie at that time is, I heard a strange sound, there was a strange suspect around the house, so I was really just out of the house looking for this suspect.
Marianne knew her daughter was lying and grounded her, but Carrie had come up with an idea to get out of being in trouble.
Carrie says she wanted Zane to come and knock on the wall of her bedroom and run off so that the mom would think, hey, there is somebody suspicious outside. So maybe Carrie was telling me the truth about why she went out, and she won't be punished.
But Carrie tells investigators that when Zane showed up that night, he barged into the house with a knife.
She's admitting to, I knew this guy was gonna come over my house, but I didn't know he was gonna murder my mom. And I lied about it because I knew he was coming over.
While Carrie remains in custody, investigators bring Zane to the station for questioning.
He said that he didn't know what Carrie was talking about. Then he was asked if he would take a polygraph, which he agreed to.
A polygraph examiner takes Zane into another room to administer the test, which elicits an unexpected revelation.
Zane ended up admitting to killing Miss Murphy.
He said it was an accident. He just got scared. He said she woke up and startled me, and I just panicked and I stabbed her. I'm like, wow, this is a new one on me. Sometimes you call them wrong.
As investigators continue talking to Zane, his confession begins to fall apart.
Zane said he had went up to the second floor and that he had stabbed Miss Murphy like 3 or 4 times, which that in itself didn't match the evidence. For one, the house that Miss Murphy lived in was a 1-story residence. There was no second floor. And 2, she was stabbed over 70 times.
On top of the errors in Zane's story, his parents are adamant that he was at home on the night of the murder. And they have proof.
He was playing video games, and there was actually pictures of him playing with time and date stamped on it.
When asked why he had confessed, Zane offers more insight into his relationship with Carrie Murphy.
It appeared that Zane would do anything for Carrie. He was infatuated with her, and she used that to her advantage. So that begs the question, what exactly is she trying to cover up?
To have someone confess to a murder that they didn't commit is manipulation at its finest.
Zane was in this whole punk rock stage, black clothes, black nails, heavy metal. So it was easy for Carrie to point the finger to him.
He says he gave a statement to Sergeant Clopton because he thought he would be released and he could go home. This is a suspect who is not of an average intelligence. So he was a little bit intimidated by the whole process. With all of that information, we decided to dismiss his charges. Then we began our investigation further into who actually committed the murder.
With suspicion escalating around Carrie Murphy's involvement, investigators sit down with her brother for questioning.
Carrie had a close relationship with her brother, and so the best route was to have conversations with her family. This is where the investigation really started to shine a light on how dark Carrie's relationship with her mother had become after Carrie and Rebecca Keller developed a very intense bond.
Mom could see the obsessions beginning, and she didn't feel that it needed to continue. She drew the line, and it was no more. You are not allowed to see her anymore.
Her mom was just very controlling over her life, over what she could do, what she could eat, whatever, anything. She was controlling.
Carrie would lie to Marianne a lot. Once Marianne would go to sleep, she would go in and steal Marianne's keys and take off with her car.
Marianne was going to punish her, took her phone from her. Rebecca gave Carrie a cell phone so that they could still communicate, and the mom wouldn't know that she was talking to her. And he said they called it the bunny phone. I asked Scott, okay, do you know that number? And he said, yeah. So he gives me that phone number. I'm going to order the phone records.
On August 6th, investigators received the phone records for Carrie's bunny phone.
The information we were able to obtain was that Carrie and Rebecca had been in constant communication leading up to the murder.
When Carrie got arrested, it was very scary. Knowing in the back of my mind was like, oh, okay, I'm next, or they're gonna come get me next. I felt like a little kid in a corner. Felt like I was being surrounded by everything closing in on me.
Investigators have arrested 16-year-old Carrie Murphy for the murder of her mother, Mary Ann. 6 weeks into the case, investigators set their sights on Carrie's girlfriend, Rebecca Keller.
The investigators came and got me from my house, took me downtown, put me in that interrogation room.
So then I started telling her, okay, well, I know that y'all were talking to each other. She says, okay. I went over there because Carrie called me and said she killed her mom. Rebecca said, so I went over there just to help her cover up. When I get there, Carrie's got blood all on her clothes. She tells Carrie, hey, you ought to make it look like a burglary. And Carrie comes up with the idea, hey, I can blame it on Zane.
Rebecca admits that she convinced Carrie to stage the scene instead, before fleeing so Carrie could call 911.
The plan was to make it look like a break-in. I decided to hide the bloody clothes, the knives and all that. I hid them in a dumpster that was down the street where a school was. The next day, I went over there, got the clothes, took them somewhere and burned them. Basically, I was owning up to getting rid of the evidence, not really owning up to carrying out the act of taking a life. I just told them somewhat of the truth and somewhat of a lie.
While both young women remain in custody, investigators continue sifting through the evidence. The search history on Carrie's cell phone seems to corroborate at least part of Rebecca's statement.
Carrie was Googling what's the quickest way to kill somebody. She used sleeping pills and just different methods.
But the phone records also suggest that Rebecca Keller was more of a collaborator than an innocent bystander.
Well, those Google searches were at the same time that she's talking on the phone with Rebecca. So I know that they're scheming this together.
It was clear that they were both involved in the planning. They wanted to be together, and Marianne stood in the way.
I was older. I was 20 years old. Carrie was 16. They seen me as the person manipulating her, and really it was the other way around. She was manipulating me. She was the one that basically called all the shots on everything.
While the young women await trial, Carrie's family posts her bail. Rebecca Keller, however, remains in jail. But as both their trial dates near, investigators still aren't sure who wielded the knife that took Marianne Murphy's life. Until a series of jailhouse phone calls exposes the gruesome truth.
All of these phone calls that these two girls had were recorded.
Rebecca says, I'm just glad that you didn't see what happened in there. And Carrie said, I did. I was in the hallway and I looked.
Rebecca says, you weren't supposed to see that. I told you to stay in your room. That let me know then, that Rebecca had done the stabbing.
Rebecca, at the beginning, she claimed she had nothing to do with the actual murder. But now we know Rebecca was the one that stabbed Miss Murphy. That jail call was as good as a confession.
It was very disturbing that Carrie would watch someone attacking her mother.
The couple's jailhouse phone calls also reveal the reason they decided to kill Marianne on July 12th.
Her mom had took her phone. It was basically gonna have it scanned or locked open or whatever, because she always kept the password on it.
Mom told her, well, what's the passcode to your phone? Carrie wouldn't give her the passcode. And the mom said, well, I'm gonna take this to work with me, and I know guys there that's gonna get this unlocked, and I'm gonna see what's going on. Carrie had been texting back and forth with her where they had been sending nude photos as well.
The text messages were not something a mother of a 16-year-old girl expected to find on a phone. They were quite intimate.
Carrie was like, I can't let Mama get back to work with that phone. And that's when she started Googling about, what's the quickest way to kill somebody. And they made that plan.
Investigators theorize that Carrie and Rebecca put their plan into action that same night.
I believe Carrie lets Rebecca in, tells her, Okay, Mom's sleeping. Rebecca tells her, okay, wait in your room.
Then Rebecca got on that bed and she proceeded to stab Mary Ann over and over and over.
The crime took place roughly around 9, but the call didn't come in until about 1. So there were some hours that were unaccounted for, which indicated that Carrie and Rebecca had took that amount of time to clean up the scene.
So after you leave and go home, what were your biggest fears?
My biggest fears was that I'd be pushed out of my family, be pushed away from people that I loved, people that I cared for, fear of being killed, being locked up for the rest of my life. A lot of things were going through my mind that night.
Coming up, Rebecca Keller opens up about the night Mary Ann Murphy was killed.
I loved her so much that I wanted to prove to her that my love for her was real.
And the young women's bond is tested behind bars.
After we were sentenced, we were together in county. I could depend on her, but the relationship changed. I started learning that she was turning on me, that she was trying to put all blame on me.
"16-year-old Carrie Murphy and 20-year-old Rebecca Keller have been charged with the July 2012 murder of Carrie's mother, Mary Ann.
I believe the motive was for Carrie and Rebecca to be together at any cost. I believe that Rebecca and Carrie both plotted to kill Mary Ann. Carrie let Rebecca in through the back door, and they murdered Carrie's mom.
This would never have happened if she had never mentioned it. And I had given her multiple occasions to walk away from this. Not just from that night, but this relationship that we were having.
I think there's still some resentment on Rebecca's part where she can't fully accept that she played an equal part in this. Both girls planned this out. They fed off of each other, and it led to the ultimate tragedy.
In December of 2012, 2 weeks before Carrie's 17th birthday, a judge rules that she will stand trial as an adult. But despite both Rebecca Keller and Carrie Murphy facing first-degree murder charges, neither case ever goes to trial.
Rebecca entered into a guilty plea. Carrie entered a plea on her own, admitted guilt, and took what the state offered.
Carrie got 30 years and Rebecca got 60 years.
To me, Carrie should have got the same thing Rebecca did. Carrie's just as guilty as Rebecca is because she stood in the doorway and watched it happen and didn't stop it.
A life was lost, and her mom will never get 30 more years. So I think that the punishment was light. I feel the same about Rebecca. I feel like her sentence was light. I just feel like any loss of life or you taking a life, and 60 years is light compared to a life that was lost.
After we were sentenced, we were together in county for a very long time. We were not sexually active with each other. We were just emotionally, mentally in a relationship. Like, we weren't really how we were before. Us being in county, I could depend on her, I could lean on her, like just like she could for me. We really just talked about our relationship, where it was gonna lead to. And so we just would talk about how much we loved each other, how much we cared about each other, how much we meant to each other. But the relationship changed. I started learning maybe a year or so after that she was turning on me. She was trying to put all blame on me and not taking any accountability, trying to say that it was my idea, that I'm the one that came up with it, when really she was the one that came up with everything.
Now, after 13 years behind bars, Rebecca Keller is ready to open up about her true role in the murder.
Carrie was talking about killing her mom for a while, for a couple of months before this even happened. I thought she was just saying it out of hurt, out of anger. I really didn't think that she was gonna really play it out. I guess when she finally did decide, she involved me. She would just tell me that it needed to be done, that she didn't want her mom to live anymore, telling me we could live happily without her. You can go in there and do this because you love me. And I did. I did love her. And I loved her so much that I wanted to prove to her that my love for her was real. We both came up with a plan, well, more of her came up with a plan to stab her, kill her. When she let me into the house, I was in disbelief that it was really gonna happen. I really thought I could just talk Carrie out of it. I was hoping she would have second thoughts about it, but she didn't.
In 2012, Rebecca Keller and Carrie Murphy were convicted of the murder of Carrie's mother, Mary Ann. Now, Rebecca Keller opens up about the night Mary Ann was murdered.
She gave me the knife. I walked into the room. I was really scared. I kind of stood over her mom a little bit, undecisive if I wanted to chicken out or not, or just grab my stuff and leave. So I walked back out. Carrie was in the kitchen and she just looked at me and she's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm scared. I'm scared to carry this on." And she manipulated me. Again, she talked me into going to the room. I guess the best thing that I knew to do was to just close my eyes and just carry on. Mary Ann was screaming, telling me to stop. And I couldn't. I just couldn't, because I had Carrie's voice in my head telling me, keep going. And I guess after the last one that I did, I didn't even realize how many or where at. It was dark. I walked out. All I could just do was just hit my knees and cry. Cry to know that I took somebody's life because of Carrie's selfishness, because of Carrie's anger towards her mom. I let her control me and manipulate me.
Do you still think about that night a lot?
I do. I still think about it. I still replay it in my head. It's been 13 years, and I deal with it every day. I regret taking somebody's life because I have to live with it for the rest of my life. To know that I took somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's aunt away from them, and I can't take that back.
It's taken Rebecca a long time to be able to speak about what really happened that night and the fact that she was the one who wielded the knife that took Mary Ann's life. And I think that goes to show the strides she has made in prison to accept responsibility and grow.
I do deserve to be punished what happened. I do feel that the amount of time that I was given was a good amount of time for the act that I carried out. but I was very angry because I feel that if she's the one that helped set everything up, why should she have a lesser sentence than me? We should both have the same sentence. But, I mean, as long as the truth is out, that's all that matters. We are not in touch at all. She steadily keeps trying to reach out to me. I've let Carrie know that I don't want nothing to do with her. She's already taken so much from me. Why am I going to allow you to take more from me? I talked to a lot of women here about the struggles that I dealt with and everything to help them if I can impact them and help them change their life. It makes me feel good to know that I may have made a mistake, but I'm where I need to be. I need to be here to help these women because they're broken. And if I can reach out and help them, that's all that matters to me.
There's never a day that goes by that I don't miss her. I miss her more than anything, but I think she was doing what she thought was right to make sure her child succeeded. But the obsession with being in love with each other drove them to do one of the darkest things that I can ever imagine.
The phone rang just before dawn. That thin, electric sound cutting through a Pennsylvania winter that had already learned how to stay silent. And on the other end was a voice that hadn't spoken this name out loud in more than 4 decades. A voice that carried the weight of a question buried since 1979. A question that never stopped asking itself in the dark. What really happened that night? And who made sure the truth stayed hidden for so long? The road was still wet from freezing rain when the first patrol car pulled up all those years ago, headlights washing over a stretch of gravel that looked ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of place people drove past without ever slowing down, and yet this was where the story began to rot from the inside out, where a single detail refused to line up, where the cold case would be born before anyone even knew how long winter could last. In 1979, this town was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and last names mattered, where high school football scores traveled faster than news from the outside world, and where everyone believed they knew everyone else, at least enough to feel safe, at least enough to believe that the worst things happened somewhere far away, on television, not here, not on these streets. The victim was found just after sunrise, discovered by someone who took the same route every morning and had done so for years, a body positioned in a way that felt wrong, too careful to be accidental, too quiet to be chaos, and as word spread, the community gathered in clusters, whispering, speculating, trying to understand how a place that felt so solid could suddenly crack. Police radios crackled with half-finished sentences, early theories thrown out and then pulled back, and from the beginning there was tension, a sense that this scene refused to behave like the others officers had worked before, that something about it resisted simple explanation, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. Evidence was collected quickly, almost urgently, bagged and tagged under gray skies, but even then mistakes were made, small ones at first, the kind that don't scream failure until years later, when someone finally notices the pattern that never quite aligned, the timeline that bent just enough to escape scrutiny. Neighbors were questioned, statements taken at kitchen tables over cups of coffee that went cold as the questions grew uncomfortable, and yet every answer seemed rehearsed by the town itself. Everyone saying just enough, everyone knowing where the invisible lines were drawn. The victim's name appeared in the local paper the next morning, framed by words like tragedy and shock, and within hours, rumors had begun to bloom, stories twisting as they passed from one mouth to another, each version less certain than the last, each one pulling the truth further out of reach. Investigators pushed forward, retracing the victim's last known movements, reconstructing a night that refused to stay still, witnesses remembering things differently with every retelling, time becoming elastic, unreliable, and somewhere in that confusion, something vital slipped through unnoticed. There was talk of a struggle, Talk of someone seen nearby, talk of a vehicle that didn't belong, but nothing solid enough to hold, nothing sharp enough to cut through the fog. And as days turned into weeks, the urgency began to cool, replaced by procedure, by paperwork, by the slow grind of a system already stretched thin. The family waited, clinging to every update, every promise that answers were coming, and each knock on the door sent a jolt through the house, hope and dread arriving together, inseparable, while investigators chased leads that led nowhere and circled back on themselves like ghosts. Behind closed doors, doubts surfaced, quiet conversations between officers who sensed there was more beneath the surface, something no one was saying out loud, something protected by silence and proximity, but without proof. Those doubts stayed exactly where the town preferred them to be. As months passed, the case file thickened while progress stalled, evidence aging in storage, memories fading at the edges, and the crime that once dominated every conversation slowly receded into the background, becoming a story people referenced in the past tense, as if distance alone could make it less unsettling. By the time the first anniversary arrived, the headlines were smaller, the questions softer, and the investigation had begun its long descent into dormancy, not closed, not solved, just suspended, waiting for something, anything, to disturb the quiet it had settled into. But cold cases don't truly sleep. They linger, accumulating pressure, absorbing the weight of unanswered questions, and in this one, buried deep beneath outdated reports and overlooked interviews, was a secret so carefully hidden it survived decades, protected not by brilliance, but by familiarity, by the assumption that some people simply don't do things like that. Years would pass, officers would retire, witnesses would move away or die, and the town would continue telling itself a version of the story that felt safer than the truth, never realizing that the evidence they thought was lost was still there, waiting patiently for someone to look at it differently, for someone to notice what had always been wrong. Because from the very beginning, something didn't fit, a detail that refused to stay buried, a question that never stopped echoing, and when the call finally came decades later, when the case was reopened and the old files were pulled back into the light, it wasn't just an investigation being revived, it was a reckoning, the start of a slow, irreversible unraveling that would force this community to confront what it had protected for far too long. The file came down from the shelf with a sound that echoed louder than it should have, cardboard scraping against metal, dust lifting into the air like something finally disturbed after years of being left alone, and as the investigator opened it, the first thing he noticed wasn't what was inside, but how heavy it felt, not in pages, but in time, in the sheer accumulation of unanswered days stacked one on top of another since 1979. The photographs were still there, curled at the edges, colors faded into a sickly yellow, crime scene tape cutting across familiar Pennsylvania ground, and suddenly the past didn't feel distant at all. It felt close enough to breathe, close enough to smell the damp earth, close enough to hear the voices that had once stood exactly where he was now, convinced they were capturing everything that mattered. The report on top was written in firm handwriting, confident, decisive, declaring early conclusions with the certainty of an era that trusted instinct over hesitation. And yet, as the investigator read it now, decades later, those conclusions felt rushed, too clean, like a story told before all the facts had arrived. The official narrative had always been simple: wrong place, wrong time, a tragedy with no clear suspect, no obvious motive, nothing that pointed strongly enough in any one direction to survive scrutiny in court. And over the years, that narrative hardened into something resembling truth, repeated often enough to feel unquestionable. But reopening a cold case isn't about accepting what's written, it's about reading between the lines, about noticing what's missing, and almost immediately, gaps began to emerge, small at first, then impossible to ignore, timelines that didn't quite line up, interviews conducted too quickly, witnesses whose statements were summarized rather than recorded verbatim. One name appeared repeatedly, always hovering at the edges of the investigation, never central, never accused, mentioned in passing as someone who was around, someone familiar, someone trusted, and each time the name surfaced, it was followed by a phrase that closed the door just as quickly as it opened. No reason to suspect. The investigator paused there, pen hovering over the page, feeling the weight of that assumption, wondering how many cases across the country had been shaped by those same words, how many secrets had been allowed to age quietly because they belonged to the right person, because accusing them would have been inconvenient. He moved deeper into the file, into witness statements that contradicted each other in subtle ways, one saying the victim left alone, another suggesting company, one recalling a car that didn't belong, another dismissing it as imagination, and yet the original investigation had smoothed these contradictions into a single, simplified version that lost its sharp edges along the way. Evidence logs told their own story, items collected but never tested, samples stored but never re-examined, technology of the time limiting what could be done, and then, inexplicably, opportunities missed even by the standards of the late 70s, moments where curiosity should have pushed further, but didn't. Outside the evidence room, the town had changed, new storefronts replacing old ones, houses renovated, streets renamed, but the emotional geography remained stubbornly the same, with certain families still carrying quiet influence, certain names still spoken with respect, and certain questions still avoided. When detectives from the original case were interviewed again, some now elderly, some long retired, their memories arrived fragmented, softened by time, but one thing was consistent: a reluctance to revisit specific moments, a tendency to gloss over decisions made under pressure, as if acknowledging them now would mean admitting something uncomfortable then. The family had never stopped asking questions, even when the town grew tired of hearing them, even when hope was treated like stubbornness, and their persistence was the reason the case was being reopened at all, a decades-long refusal to accept that silence equaled resolution. They remembered things differently, too. Details dismissed back then as emotional distortion, now suddenly aligning with the inconsistencies in the file. Stories about who was where, who arrived too quickly, who seemed to know things before they were officially released. The investigator felt the shift then, subtle but unmistakable, the moment when a cold case stops feeling like an academic exercise and starts feeling personal, when the distance between past and present collapses and the questions become sharper, more urgent. He requested the physical evidence, every box, every envelope, even items previously deemed irrelevant, and as they were laid out under modern lights, the shortcomings of the original examination became painfully clear, not because those officers were careless, but because the truth had been inconvenient, because following it would have required challenging the assumptions the town depended on. A single item drew his attention, something that had always been there but never truly looked at, its significance buried beneath outdated testing methods and premature conclusions, and as he held it now, gloved hands steady, he understood that this case hadn't gone cold because it was unsolvable. It had gone cold because no one had been ready to see what it was trying to say. Outside, the town carried on, unaware that beneath its familiar routines, the past was stirring, that a secret protected by years of silence was beginning to fracture, and that the story everyone thought they knew was about to change in ways no one had prepared for. The evidence room was silent in the way only secure places ever are, sealed off from the noise of the present, holding its breath while the past waits to speak, and as the investigator stood there, surrounded by boxes stamped with dates from another lifetime, he felt the uneasy sensation that something inside these walls had been awake all along, simply ignored. The item he couldn't stop thinking about rested on stainless steel now, unimpressive at first glance, ordinary, the kind of thing that disappears into the background when investigators are overwhelmed by bigger questions, bigger theories, bigger pressures, and that ordinariness was exactly why it had survived untouched for so long. Back in 1979, it had been catalogued quickly, photographed once, bagged, labeled, and quietly dismissed, its potential buried under assumptions that felt reasonable at the time, assumptions shaped by limited tools and an unspoken desire to move on. Now, under modern lighting, it looked different not because it had changed, but because the way it was being seen had changed, and the investigator understood that cold cases don't reopen because of new evidence, they reopen because of new eyes. He reviewed the original notes again, every word, every margin scribble, every omission, and what struck him wasn't incompetence but confidence, a belief that the truth had already been identified, that further questioning would only complicate things, and in that confidence lay the case's greatest vulnerability. The timeline, once considered solid, began to warp under scrutiny, minutes stretching into unexplored gaps, hours compressed into neat explanations that no longer held, and suddenly the window of opportunity for someone to act was wider than anyone had admitted before. Witness statements, when played against one another rather than blended together, revealed fractures, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle shifts in tone, in certainty, in what people emphasized and what they avoided, the kind of inconsistencies that don't scream deception but whisper discomfort. One witness in particular stood out, not because of what they said, but because of how little had been asked, their statement short, summarized, sanitized, ending just as it approached something undefined, something that might have required follow-up questions no one wanted to ask. The investigator requested the original audio, hoping against experience that it still existed, and when he learned it had been lost years ago, erased or recorded over, the absence felt louder than any confession. Outside the department, the family's story continued to live in fragments, memories passed down, details sharpened by repetition rather than dulled, and while the official record treated their recollections as emotional noise, the investigator began to see them as a parallel archive, one built from lived experience rather than procedure. They spoke of behaviors that didn't make sense, of reactions that felt rehearsed, of moments when grief had been overshadowed by something colder, something calculating, and though none of it had been enough to act on back then, together it formed a pattern that no longer felt accidental. As days passed, the case began to draw attention inside the department, quiet at first, then curious, then cautious, as colleagues stopped by under the pretense of offering help, their eyes lingering on the boxes, their questions carefully phrased, and the investigator sensed the same tension that had once settled over the original team, the awareness that reopening the case meant reopening old decisions. Some officers welcomed it, eager to see justice finally delivered, while others carried an unspoken anxiety, a fear that the truth, once exposed, might implicate more than just a single name, might challenge the institution's own history. The investigator pushed forward anyway, driven by a growing certainty that the case hadn't been stalled by a lack of answers, but by the presence of one too early, one too convenient, one that had allowed everyone to stop looking. Laboratory requests were filed, modern tests authorized, processes that hadn't existed when the case was first investigated, and as the evidence was prepared for re-examination, there was a sense of anticipation that bordered on dread, the kind that comes when you realize the past is about to answer back. In the meantime, he tracked down secondary witnesses, people who hadn't been central enough to matter back then, neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, individuals whose names appeared once or twice in the file and then vanished, and time had done something strange to them, loosening their caution, eroding their loyalty to the old narrative. They remembered things now that they hadn't shared before, not because they were new, but because they no longer felt bound by the same social gravity, and their stories introduced a new element into the case: fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of accusing the wrong person. Fear of speaking against someone with standing, with connections, with a reputation that had seemed untouchable in 1979. One person admitted they had almost gone to the police with concerns back then, had even rehearsed what they would say, but after a conversation with someone they trusted, someone who assured them everything had already been handled, they let it go, choosing silence over disruption. The investigator wrote it all down, careful not to editorialize, aware that memory is a fragile thing, but also aware that patterns don't form by coincidence alone. As the pieces accumulated, a new version of events began to emerge, not replacing the old one outright, but overlapping it, revealing where the original story had been thinned, simplified, stripped of its complexity. Late one evening, alone in his office, surrounded by photocopies and timelines taped to the wall, the investigator noticed something that made his breath catch, a detail so small it could have been overlooked 100 times, a timestamp, a note scribbled in the margin, an acknowledgement that someone had been somewhere they weren't supposed to be. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. He followed it back through the file, through interviews and reports, and each time it appeared, it had been explained away, rationalized, dismissed as coincidence, and yet now it felt deliberate, consistent, purposeful. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a case that had been guided, nudged gently away from uncomfortable territory, steered toward explanations that preserved order rather than truth. The lab results were still days away, time stretching painfully as the investigator waited, knowing that whatever came back would either validate the direction he was heading or force him to start again. But deep down, he already sensed the outcome. The town remained unaware, lights glowing in houses built long after the crime, routines unbroken, children growing up unaware of the secret woven into their streets. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, a pressure building that could no longer be contained. The past had been patient, waiting quietly for technology, for courage, for someone willing to ask the questions that hadn't been asked before, and now, after decades of silence, it was finally beginning to speak, not loudly, not yet, but clearly enough that ignoring it was no longer an option. The moment a case reaches this stage, the air changes, not with celebration, not with relief, but with a tightening, a sense that every step from here on carries consequences that can't be undone, and the investigator felt it as he walked the familiar halls of the department, the walls suddenly closer, the silence heavier than before. This was no longer about whether the case could be solved. It was about whether the truth would be allowed to stand once it was exposed. He began moving carefully, deliberately, knowing that mistakes now wouldn't just slow the investigation, they would be seized upon, amplified, used as shields by anyone invested in keeping the past undisturbed. The first step was quiet verification, confirming the familial DNA lead without alerting the town, without tipping off anyone who might still have influence, and as records were pulled and cross-checked, the picture sharpened with unsettling clarity. The relative identified by the database lived hundreds of miles away now, had built a life entirely disconnected from the place where the crime occurred, and when contacted, they were cooperative, confused, shaken by the realization that something buried in their family history had resurfaced in this way. They didn't know the details. They didn't know the victim. But they knew the name that sat at the root of their family tree, the same name that had begun appearing with increasing frequency in the reopened case file. The investigator didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He listened. And what emerged was not a confession, not a revelation, but a pattern of stories passed down in fragments, strange silences around certain years, a relative who had left town abruptly, who never spoke about why, who reacted with discomfort whenever the past was mentioned. It wasn't proof, but it was confirmation that the DNA had pointed in the right direction. Back at the department, the investigator rebuilt the suspect's life in 1979 minute by minute, layering work schedules over social obligations, mapping movements against witness statements, and with each pass, the same conclusion emerged. This person had both the opportunity and the access to commit the crime and to influence how it was handled afterward. The original alibi, once accepted without challenge, began to collapse under modern scrutiny, dependent on timelines that no longer held, witnesses whose certainty faded under direct questioning, and records that were either incomplete or conveniently vague. The investigator requested financial documents next, understanding that motive often hides where people assume it doesn't belong, and there, buried beneath routine transactions, was the first tangible suggestion of why the crime may have occurred, a dispute minimized at the time, a connection dismissed as insignificant, now suddenly illuminated. Money. Obligation, leverage, the kind of motive that doesn't announce itself loudly, that doesn't look like rage or desperation, but like calculation, like a decision made calmly and justified afterward. As these threads tightened, the investigator faced an unavoidable reality. Bringing this case forward would mean accusing someone who had lived for decades without suspicion, someone whose reputation had been allowed to calcify into fact, someone with connections that still reached into the town's institutions. Meetings were held behind closed doors, prosecutors briefed cautiously, language chosen with precision, every claim supported, every inference double-checked, and still, resistance emerged, not overt, not obstructionist, but hesitant, framed as concern, as prudence, as a reminder of how difficult cold cases are to prosecute. The investigator understood the subtext. Time had not just eroded evidence, it had built loyalty, and dismantling that loyalty would be as difficult as proving the crime itself. He returned to the victim's family, sitting with them in a room that had borne witness to decades of waiting, and for the first time, he didn't speak in generalities or careful optimism. He told them the truth as far as he could, that progress had been made, that answers were closer than they had ever been, that the story they'd been told for years was incomplete. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cry. They listened with a stillness that spoke of endurance, of a grief that had learned how to survive without resolution, and when he finished, one of them asked a question so simple it cut through everything else. Why now? The investigator didn't answer immediately, because the truth was uncomfortable. Because the answer wasn't just technology. It was willingness. Because for years, no one had wanted to ask the questions that threatened the foundation of the town's story. As the investigation accelerated, word began to leak. Not specifics, but whispers, a sense that something old had been disturbed, that familiar names were being spoken in unfamiliar contexts, and the town reacted the way it always had, with denial first, then defensiveness. People remembered the suspect differently now, recalling kindnesses, favors, shared history, pushing back against the idea that someone they trusted could be capable of something so final, so violent. The investigator anticipated it. He'd seen it before. He focused instead on preparation, ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would do so with enough weight to withstand the inevitable backlash. The DNA profile was refined further, strengthened by additional markers, narrowing the margin of doubt, and when the final report arrived, it left little room for interpretation. This was no coincidence. This was not contamination. This was connection. The investigators stared at the results for a long time, aware that this single document carried the power to rewrite history, to expose a secret that had survived on the assumption that time alone could protect it. The next step was inevitable. He requested authorization to confront the suspect. Not to arrest. Not yet. To listen. Because after decades of silence, lies have a way of unraveling when faced with evidence that doesn't argue, doesn't threaten, but simply exists. As the request moved up the chain, the investigator felt the tension reach a breaking point, the case now poised between revelation and resistance, the outcome dependent not on what happened in 1979, but on what people were willing to accept now. Outside, the town continued its routines, unaware that a reckoning was approaching, that the quiet agreement it had lived under for more than 40 years was about to be challenged, not by rumor, not by accusation, but by proof that had waited patiently for someone brave enough to bring it back into the light. The decision to confront him wasn't dramatic, not a slammed fist on a table or a shouted declaration. It arrived quietly, signed off with measured language and careful conditions, the kind of approval that acknowledges what's coming without saying it out loud. The investigators studied the suspect's photograph before the meeting, not searching for guilt, not looking for villainy, just trying to understand how someone could live an entire life balanced on a secret and never let it show. Age had softened him. Lines etched into his face spoke of time passing normally, predictably, the way it does for people who believe their past is settled, and that normalcy was what made the upcoming conversation so dangerous. They chose a neutral room. No handcuffs. No uniforms. Just a table, 2 chairs, a recorder placed carefully between them like a third presence that would remember everything even if they didn't want it to. When he walked in, the suspect looked unsurprised, curious rather than alarmed, offering a polite greeting, the kind of man who had spent years being regarded as respectable, helpful, unremarkable. The investigator began gently, grounding the conversation in familiarity, in shared history, asking about life in the town back then, about work, about routines, and the suspect answered easily, almost nostalgically, painting a picture of simpler times, of community, of everyone knowing everyone else. There was no hesitation, no visible tension, and that, in itself, was revealing. As the questions moved closer to the year in question, closer to the night that had frozen itself in the town's memory, the suspect's tone didn't change, but his words did, becoming broader, less precise, details replaced by generalities, memories softened at the edges. The investigator didn't interrupt. He let the silence stretch when it needed to, allowed the suspect to fill it with explanations that drifted just far enough from certainty to matter. Then, slowly, methodically, he introduced the inconsistencies. Not accusations, not challenges, just facts. A time that didn't align. A place that conflicted with another account. A detail that had been remembered differently by someone else. Each one landed softly, but together they formed a weight the suspect couldn't ignore, and for the first time, a crack appeared, subtle, almost imperceptible, a pause that lasted half a second too long. The investigator watched closely. This wasn't the reaction of an innocent man shocked by false implications. It was the reaction of someone recalculating, adjusting, searching for footing that no longer existed. Still, the suspect denied involvement, calmly, confidently, insisting that the past had already been examined, that nothing new could change what was known, and the investigator nodded, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Then he shifted. He spoke about technology, about how time doesn't erase evidence the way it used to, about how small things, overlooked things, can survive long enough to be understood later. The suspect listened carefully now, eyes fixed on the table, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and when the investigator mentioned DNA, not details, not sources, just the word itself, the reaction was immediate. A breath held, a blink delayed, a swallow that came too late. It wasn't confession, but it was recognition. The investigator didn't press. He let the moment exist, allowed the suspect to sit with the knowledge that something immutable had entered the room, something that didn't rely on memory or loyalty or reputation. The suspect recovered quickly, questioning the validity of such evidence, pointing out age, degradation, the possibility of error, and the investigator agreed with him, calmly, acknowledging the complexity while never retreating from the core truth. Evidence speaks whether people believe it or not. As the interview continued, the suspect's narrative grew more defensive, not louder, not angrier, but more insistent, as if repetition alone might rebuild the certainty he felt slipping away. He invoked the town, the investigation, the officers who had cleared him decades ago, the life he had built since. The investigator listened to all of it, recording every word, every shift, every attempt to anchor himself to the authority of the past. And then, near the end, the investigator did something deliberate. He stopped talking. The silence stretched. Seconds passed. Then more. The recorder hummed quietly, documenting the absence of sound. And in that space, the suspect spoke again, unprompted, filling the void with something he hadn't intended to say. A detail.
Small.
Specific. A fact about the night that hadn't been mentioned earlier. A fact that hadn't been public. The investigator's eyes flicked to the recorder, then back to the suspect, who realized too late what he'd done, the words already released, irreversible. The interview ended shortly after, polite on the surface, restrained, the suspect leaving the room composed but changed, the confidence he'd arrived with now fractured by uncertainty. Alone again, the investigator reviewed the recording, isolating that moment, replaying it, recognizing its significance immediately. This wasn't a confession, but it was a leak. And leaks, once they start, rarely stop. He shared the recording with the prosecutor, alongside the DNA findings, the rebuilt timeline, the witness statements newly recontextualized, and for the first time, the response wasn't cautious. It was focused. The question was no longer whether the case could move forward. It was how. Legal strategy took over then, deliberate and precise. Every step weighed against the risk of defense challenges, every move designed to withstand scrutiny not just from a jury, but from a town that would feel personally accused by the truth. The suspect was monitored quietly, not surveilled aggressively, but observed, his routines noted, his interactions watched for signs of preparation, of flight, of panic. None came. Instead, he continued living as he always had, attending events, speaking casually with neighbors, a man who still believed that denial might be enough, that the past might still hesitate out of respect. But inside the department, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. This was no longer a reopened cold case. It was an active countdown. The investigator revisited the family again, this time with more certainty in his voice, not promising outcomes, but acknowledging momentum, and for the first time in decades, they allowed themselves to imagine an ending, not closure, not healing, but truth. They spoke of the years spent waiting, of holidays marked by absence, of birthdays that passed without answers, and the investigator listened, aware that whatever happened next would ripple far beyond the courtroom. As warrants were drafted and arrest scenarios discussed, the investigator found himself thinking back to that moment in the evidence room, the dust rising from the box, the sound of cardboard scraping metal, the instant when the past had been disturbed. It hadn't resisted. It had waited. And now, with the machinery of justice finally aligned, with evidence that could no longer be dismissed and silence that could no longer protect, the case moved toward its inevitable reckoning, the truth inching closer to daylight, unstoppable, indifferent to the comfort of those who had lived in its shadow for far too long. The warrant didn't arrive with drama either. No triumphant announcement, no raised voices, just a document slid across a desk, signed with the weight of decades behind it, and when the investigator held it in his hands, he felt the gravity settle in his chest, heavy and irreversible. This was the line. Everything before had been preparation. Everything after would be consequence. The arrest plan was quiet by design, constructed to avoid spectacle, to avoid giving the town a moment to harden its defenses before the truth arrived, and as officers reviewed routes, timing, contingencies, the investigator noticed how careful everyone was, how deliberate, as if the room itself understood that this wasn't just another suspect. This was a mirror being held up to the past. They moved in the early hours, when streets are empty and routines are predictable, when denial is still asleep, and when the knock came, it was firm but restrained, the sound of inevitability rather than force. The suspect opened the door slowly, already dressed, as if he'd been expecting something, though perhaps not this, and for a moment there was a flicker in his eyes, not fear, not surprise, but recognition, the look of someone who knows the long delay has finally ended.
He didn't resist.
He didn't argue. As he was informed of the charge, his shoulders sagged slightly, a physical release after years of holding something upright through sheer will, and the investigator watched closely, noting the absence of outrage, the absence of disbelief. Innocence tends to protest. Guilt tends to calculate. The news didn't stay quiet for long. It never does. By mid-morning, the town was buzzing with fragments, half-truths racing ahead of facts, names whispered before they were confirmed, disbelief colliding with curiosity, and the investigator knew the backlash would come in waves. At first, it was shock. Then anger. Then bargaining. People demanded explanations, asked how this could happen now, questioned why the past was being disturbed, and beneath it all was the unspoken fear that if this story had been wrong, what else might be? The department released a carefully worded statement, acknowledging the arrest without detailing the evidence, and immediately, sides formed, lines drawn not by facts but by familiarity, by memory, by loyalty to a version of the town that felt safer. The suspect's family responded with disbelief, issuing their own statements, defending the man they knew, questioning the reliability of evidence gathered so long after the fact, and the investigator understood their reaction, recognized it as the same instinct he'd seen in countless cases, the refusal to reconcile the private person with the public act. But evidence doesn't care about belief. As the legal process began, the suspect's demeanor changed subtly, not collapsing, not confessing, but shifting into something more rigid, more defensive, as if the weight he'd carried for years had been replaced by a different kind of burden, one that demanded constant vigilance. Interviews continued, this time with attorneys present, words chosen carefully, silence used strategically, and yet, even now, cracks appeared, moments where the old habits resurfaced, where he spoke as if the truth were still something he could manage rather than something that would now manage him. The prosecutor assembled the case piece by piece, not relying on a single revelation but on accumulation, on the quiet power of alignment, DNA that placed him at the center, timelines that closed in around him, statements that no longer contradicted each other once fear was removed. And then there was that detail from the interview, the slip, the fact he couldn't have known unless he had been there, and when it was placed in context, stripped of ambiguity, it became devastating. The defense attacked aggressively, as expected, questioning the science, the methods, the motivations, suggesting tunnel vision, suggesting pressure, suggesting that the desire for resolution had overridden objectivity, and the investigator watched from the gallery as decades of doubt were rehearsed aloud. But this time, the questions didn't land the way they once would have, because the case wasn't being asked to stand on memory alone. Expert witnesses testified, explaining degradation, probability, the impossibility of coincidence, and while the language was technical, the implication was simple. The past had left a mark, and that mark had survived. As proceedings unfolded, new voices emerged, people who had stayed silent for years now stepping forward, emboldened by the fact that the truth was no longer hypothetical, sharing details they had once dismissed as unimportant or dangerous, and each addition tightened the narrative, closing gaps that had existed for decades. The town's reaction grew more complex. Some clung to denial, insisting the arrest was a mistake, an overreach, a betrayal of the past, while others began to reconsider their own memories, their own assumptions, wondering how many signs they'd ignored because it was easier not to see. The victim's family sat through it all, absorbing each development with a quiet resilience that came only from long endurance, and when asked how it felt to finally see movement, they struggled to answer, because resolution doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, unevenly, bringing relief and pain in equal measure. The investigator checked in with them often, not as a procedural obligation but as a reminder of why the case existed at all, grounding himself in the human cost beneath the legal language, the birthdays missed, the years defined by absence. Behind the scenes, the defense explored every avenue, filing motions, challenging admissibility, attempting to fracture the case before it reached a jury, and each time, the prosecutor responded methodically, confident not because of bravado, but because the foundation was finally solid. When the motion to suppress the DNA evidence was denied, the tone shifted again. The suspect's composure began to crack, not publicly, not dramatically, but in private moments, requests for reassurance, questions that betrayed anxiety rather than confidence, and the investigator recognized the change for what it was. The realization that time, which had protected him for so long, was now working against him. Media attention intensified, national outlets picking up the story, framing it as a triumph of persistence, of science, of justice delayed but not denied, and while the narrative played well beyond the town's borders, locally it felt more like a reckoning than a victory. Old wounds reopened. Old decisions re-examined. People began asking uncomfortable questions about the original investigation, about why certain leads had been ignored, why certain voices hadn't been heard, and while there was no appetite for scapegoats, there was a growing acknowledgement that the truth had been inconvenient back then. As trial dates were set, the investigator found himself reflecting on the nature of cold cases, on how they don't freeze so much as they linger, suspended by collective choice, waiting for conditions to change, and in this case, those conditions had finally aligned. Late one night, he returned to the evidence room again, standing where it had all restarted, the shelves now quieter somehow, as if aware that one of their secrets had been extracted, and he thought about the randomness of it, how easily the evidence could have been lost, destroyed, forgotten entirely. But it hadn't been. And neither had the truth. As the town braced itself for the final phase, for testimony that would crystallize decades of uncertainty into a single narrative, the investigator understood that whatever the verdict, the case had already altered the community, forcing it to confront the cost of silence, the danger of assumption, the fragility of justice when comfort is allowed to outweigh curiosity. The countdown continued, no longer hidden, no longer whispered, moving steadily toward a moment that would answer the question the town had lived with for more than 40 years, not just who did it, but how so many had lived alongside the answer, without ever seeing it. The courtroom filled slowly, not with spectacle but with a careful gravity, people choosing their seats as if placement alone might reveal which side of history they intended to sit on, and when the jury was sworn in, the investigator felt the weight shift again, the story no longer contained within files and interviews, but released into a space where it would be tested aloud. Opening statements avoided emotion, avoided flourish, because none was needed, the prosecutor laying out a sequence of facts with measured restraint, emphasizing time, patience, and alignment, while the defense framed the case as a dangerous reach, a collision between modern tools and ancient uncertainty, warning against mistaking probability for proof. The investigator listened from the gallery, hands folded, breathing slow, knowing that everything he had touched, questioned, and reconstructed would now be filtered through 12 strangers who had not lived with the case the way he had. The first witnesses spoke about the town as it was in 1979, about routines, about the night that changed everything, and their voices carried the strain of memory stretched thin, details wavering, certainty punctured by the simple admission of time passing. Then came the evidence. The physical item that had waited silently for decades was presented with care, handled with gloves, explained step by step, the chain of custody reconstructed not as a single line, but as a series of decisions, some accidental, some intentional, all now under scrutiny. The forensic expert spoke plainly, describing degradation, probability, the mathematical unlikelihood of coincidence, and though the language was technical, the meaning landed with clarity. This was not guesswork. The defense cross-examined aggressively, probing for doubt, emphasizing contamination risks, highlighting the years between collection and analysis, suggesting alternative explanations, but each question was met with calm precision, the answers grounded in process rather than opinion. When the familial DNA connection was explained, there was a visible reaction in the room, a collective intake of breath as the concept settled, the realization that the truth had arrived sideways, through someone entirely unrelated to the crime, and the investigators saw the jurors lean forward, attention sharpening. This was new ground for many of them. Witnesses followed, one by one, their stories aligning more tightly now than they ever had before, small inconsistencies acknowledged rather than ignored, context added where fear had once erased it, and with each testimony, the narrative gained density, not through drama, but through coherence. Then came the interview recording. The room grew still as the audio played, the suspect's voice steady at first, then shifting, the silence captured as clearly as the words themselves, and when the slip occurred, that moment of unintended specificity, it landed like a dropped object, impossible to miss once heard. The defense objected. The judge overruled. The investigator watched the jury, saw the subtle changes, the recalibration happening in real time, understanding forming not from a single revelation, but from accumulation, from the quiet realization that the story being told now accounted for everything the old one could not. The suspect did not testify. It was a strategic choice, expected, yet heavy, leaving the narrative uncontested except through argument, and as closing statements approached, the atmosphere tightened, anticipation mixing with exhaustion, the weight of decades pressing into the final hours. The prosecutor spoke last, not appealing to emotion, not invoking sympathy, but emphasizing patience, reminding the jury that justice does not always arrive quickly, but when it does, it demands to be recognized, even if it disrupts long-held beliefs. The defense warned against certainty, against the seduction of closure, urging caution, urging restraint, framing doubt as responsibility. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled collectively, conversations hushed, families gathered quietly, and the investigators stepped outside, feeling the cool air hit his face, grounding him in the present moment. Hours passed. Each one felt longer than the last. He thought about the victim, about the life interrupted, about the years spent as a question rather than a memory, and he wondered whether resolution, if it came, would feel as definitive as everyone imagined. When the jury returned, the room filled again, the sound of chairs shifting too loud, the clerk's voice steady as the verdict was read, and in that moment, the investigator felt the culmination of everything, not as triumph, but as release. The town would process this slowly. The family would grieve anew. The truth would ripple outward, changing conversations, altering memories, reframing the past. As the courtroom emptied, The investigator remained seated for a moment longer, listening to the fading echoes, aware that while the case had reached its legal conclusion, its emotional one would take far longer. Justice, he understood now, doesn't erase the past. It clarifies it. After the verdict, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, thick with everything that had been said too late and everything that could never be said at all. The courtroom emptied in slow waves, footsteps echoing against polished floors, voices hushed as if the building itself demanded restraint, and outside, the town waited, suspended between relief and disbelief, unsure how to absorb a truth that had finally chosen to surface. The investigator watched the suspect one last time as he was led away, not searching for remorse, not expecting revelation, only noticing how ordinary the moment looked, how unremarkable the end of something so enormous could be. No outburst. No collapse. Just procedure. Justice rarely announces itself with spectacle. More often, it arrives like this, quiet, procedural, undeniable. News spread fast. Faster than facts ever had. Headlines condensed decades into a few brutal words. Cold case solved. Killer convicted. Truth revealed. The language was sharp, efficient, designed for impact, but it couldn't capture the complexity underneath, the years of waiting, the false starts, the damage done by uncertainty alone. The investigator knew that for many, this would feel like an ending. For those closest to it, it was something else entirely. The victim's family faced cameras they had avoided for years, answering questions they never should have had to answer, their expressions controlled but fragile, grief resurfacing in unfamiliar forms. Closure was the word everyone wanted to use. They didn't. They spoke instead about answers, about finally knowing, about the burden of wondering lifting just enough to allow breath again. It wasn't relief. It was release. Inside the department, there was no celebration. No congratulatory speeches. The mood was reflective, almost subdued. The case was reviewed one final time, not to admire the outcome, but to understand the process, to examine what had failed decades earlier and why. Files were annotated, procedures questioned, lessons extracted with care. This wasn't about blame. It was about responsibility. The investigator was asked, repeatedly, how it felt to solve a case like this. He struggled with the question every time. Solve implied simplicity. It implied that something broken had been fixed cleanly. This had been messier than that. This had been excavation. It had required disturbing foundations, challenging assumptions, accepting that comfort and truth rarely coexist. The town reacted unevenly. Some embraced the verdict immediately, grateful for clarity, eager to move forward. Others resisted, clinging to the image they had held for decades, insisting the past was being rewritten unfairly, that too much time had passed for certainty. Conversations grew tense. Old friendships cooled. Memory itself became contested ground. The investigator understood this reaction better than most. When truth contradicts identity, it doesn't just inform, it threatens. And for a town that had built part of its sense of safety on the belief that the crime had been an anomaly, an unsolvable tragedy with no clear villain, the revelation was destabilizing. It suggested something far more unsettling, that the answer had always been nearby. Requests began coming in. Other departments, other families, cold cases long forgotten suddenly reopened, hope reignited by proof that time alone does not defeat evidence. The investigator fielded calls carefully, aware that not every story would end the same way, that this case was as much about chance as persistence. But he also knew that silence was no longer an excuse. He returned, once more, to the evidence room. The box that had started it all sat back on the shelf, lighter now, some of its contents finally understood, others still waiting. He ran his fingers along the edge, thinking about how easily it could have been discarded, how close the truth had come to disappearing forever. The margin between knowing and never knowing was thinner than anyone liked to admit. At home, sleep came unevenly. Dreams replayed fragments, voices, timelines, moments where a single decision had altered everything. Solving the case hadn't quieted his mind the way he'd expected. Instead, It sharpened it, made him more aware of how many stories were still unresolved, how many answers still locked behind neglect, fear, or indifference. The victim's name began appearing again, not just in connection with the crime, but as a person. Articles mentioned hobbies. Photographs circulated. Stories surfaced that had nothing to do with how they died, and everything to do with how they lived. This, more than the verdict, felt like restoration. As weeks passed, the town settled into a new normal. The stories stopped leading the news. Other tragedies took its place. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. People spoke more carefully about the past. They listened more closely when something didn't add up. The assumption that time alone would bury truth no longer felt safe. The investigator was offered commendations. He accepted them quietly, aware that recognition was a byproduct, not a goal. The real reward had already been delivered, not to him, but to those who had waited without answers for most of their lives. He never forgot that. In moments of quiet, he thought about the suspect, about the years spent believing the secret would never surface, about the strange arithmetic of guilt postponed but never erased. Time had protected him for a while. It had also preserved the evidence that would undo him. There was a symmetry there that felt almost deliberate. The case was closed on paper, digitally archived, labeled resolved. But in reality, it remained alive, carried forward in memory, in conversation, in the altered understanding of what justice can look like when it arrives late, but undeniable. And as the investigator prepared to move on to the next file, the next unanswered question, he carried this one with him, not as a triumph, but as a reminder that truth does not expire, that silence is not innocence, and that sometimes the past doesn't need to be chased. It only needs someone willing to open the box and listen. In the weeks that followed, the case refused to fade quietly into the archives, lingering instead like a low-frequency hum beneath everyday life, audible only if you listen closely, and the investigator found that even routine tasks now carried a different weight, every file a reminder that certainty is often an illusion maintained by habit rather than proof. He was invited to speak at conferences, asked to summarize the process, to explain the breakthrough as if it were a formula that could be replicated on command, and each time he resisted that framing, careful to emphasize how fragile the chain had been, how easily it could have snapped at any point. This wasn't a story of inevitability. It was a story of attention, of noticing what others had stepped around. Back in the town, the physical spaces tied to the crime took on a strange significance, no longer neutral landmarks but sites layered with new meaning, people passing them more slowly now, glancing longer, remembering details they'd once ignored, the environment itself becoming part of the narrative. Some residents avoided the subject entirely, exhausted by the emotional whiplash, while others leaned into it, holding forums, writing letters, debating responsibility, ethics, the difference between suspicion and proof, and whether justice delayed could still be called justice at all. The investigator watched these discussions from a distance, aware that his role had ended, that the story now belonged to the community, to the family, to the public record, and yet he felt tethered to it, pulled back by the knowledge that the outcome had not erased the cost. The victim's family began navigating a new reality, one without the ache of uncertainty, but filled with the unfamiliar terrain of confirmed loss, grief reshaped by clarity, memories no longer competing with doubt, and while some found comfort in that, others struggled with the permanence of it. They invited the investigator to a private gathering, not a celebration, not a memorial, just a moment of acknowledgement, a way to mark the transition from waiting to knowing, and he attended quietly, listening more than he spoke, aware that nothing he could say would equal what they had endured. They talked about the years between, about how the case had hovered over their lives like weather, sometimes background, sometimes storm, shaping decisions, relationships, expectations, and one of them said something that stayed with him long after the evening ended. "It's strange," they said. "We spent so long thinking the answer would change everything. Now that we have it, it just changes how we carry what was already there." That, he realized, was the truth of it. Answers don't erase pain.
They reorganize it.
Meanwhile, internal reviews continued quietly within the department, Not punitive, not defensive, but honest, revisiting the original investigation with modern eyes, acknowledging blind spots shaped by culture, hierarchy, and the unspoken rules of the time. No one wanted to rewrite history to look better than it was. They wanted to understand it well enough not to repeat it. Training protocols were updated. Evidence retention policies reinforced. Cold case units given renewed attention, not as symbolic gestures, but as practical investments, and the investigators saw something rare begin to form, an institutional willingness to admit that past certainty had been misplaced. Requests for interviews slowed. The headlines moved on. But occasionally, a letter arrived, handwritten, from someone connected tangentially to the case, a former neighbor, a distant relative, someone who had known something once but hadn't known how to speak it. Some expressed regret, others gratitude. None of them changed the outcome, but each one added texture to the story, confirming that silence had not been the absence of truth, only its containment. The investigator returned to his usual workload, yet the rhythm felt altered, his patience sharper, his tolerance for assumption thinner, and when younger officers asked about the case, he didn't emphasize the science or the drama. He talked instead about humility, about how certainty can be dangerous when it's inherited rather than earned. Late one night, working alone, he reopened the digital case file, scrolling through the timeline one final time, not to search for mistakes, but to observe the arc, the way unrelated details had eventually converged, how chance and persistence had intertwined until the story could no longer remain fragmented. He noticed something he hadn't before, a note from an early interview, dismissed at the time as irrelevant, now clearly pointing in the right direction, and it struck him how close the truth had been even then, how easily it had been sidestepped. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity. Cold cases aren't unsolved because answers don't exist. They're unsolved because answers are inconvenient. As the investigators shut down the system and prepared to leave, he felt a sense of quiet resolve settle in, not satisfaction, not closure, but commitment, the understanding that this case was not an anomaly but a reminder, a demonstration of what happens when patience outlasts denial. Outside, the town lights glowed softly, ordinary and unchanged, and yet beneath that normalcy, something fundamental had shifted, a collective awareness that the past is not fixed, that it can reach forward, demand attention, and alter the present when given the chance. The case no longer needed him, but its lesson would follow him into every room, every interview, every unopened box, whispering the same warning again and again, that truth does not disappear when ignored, it only waits, and when it returns, it does so without regard for comfort, reputation, or time. Time moved forward, but not away. The case settled into the investigator's life like a second shadow, not always visible, but always present, stretching across new work, new files, new faces, and every so often, catching the light at just the right angle to remind him what persistence can uncover and what complacency can bury. Other cold cases crossed his desk, some older, some newer, all of them carrying that same quiet accusation, that same question hanging in the margins. What if this one, too, had been waiting for someone to look differently? He found himself slowing down, reading deeper, listening longer, no longer satisfied with explanations that relied on habit or tradition. In meetings, when someone said it was probably nothing, he asked why. When someone said that lead went nowhere, he asked how far it had really gone. The solved case had rewired his instincts. Outside the department, the town continued its careful adjustment, not rewriting its history, but re-examining it, acknowledging that memory is selective and comfort often edits more aggressively than time. Murals went untouched. Streets kept their names. But conversations shifted. Stories once told with certainty were retold with hesitation, qualifiers slipping in where absolutes had lived for decades. There were moments of resistance, of course. Letters to the editor insisting the verdict was wrong. Online forums clinging to alternate theories. The investigator read some of them late at night, not out of defensiveness, but curiosity, recognizing the same patterns he'd seen in himself early on, the human need to preserve a version of the world that feels coherent. Denial, he'd learned, isn't stubbornness. It's protection. The victim's family withdrew from the public eye gradually, not disappearing, just reclaiming privacy piece by piece, their lives no longer defined by a question mark, but by something heavier and more solid. The investigator checked in less often now, respecting the space they needed to reorient themselves without the constant intrusion of the case that had shaped them. When they did speak, it was about ordinary things. Weather.
Work.
Children growing up. Proof, if any were needed, that resolution doesn't end life. It allows it to continue without the drag of uncertainty. At the department, a new cold case unit was formally established, small but focused, staffed by people who understood patience as a skill rather than a weakness. The investigator didn't lead it, by choice, preferring to remain embedded where his experience could quietly influence, without becoming doctrine. He didn't want the solved case to become mythology. He wanted it to become precedent. Training sessions referenced it carefully, not as a miracle, not as proof that every case could be cracked, but as an example of what happens when evidence is respected over assumptions, when silence is treated as information rather than absence. Younger officers listened intently, some inspired, some intimidated, all aware that the standard had shifted. Late one afternoon, an envelope appeared on his desk with no return address. Inside was a single page, typed and signed, containing a brief message. "I knew something once.
I didn't say it.
I thought it was too late. Now I know it wasn't." There were no details. No case referenced. Just that sentence. He sat with it for a long time, understanding exactly what it meant. The past, when disturbed, doesn't just give up one truth. It loosens others. He logged the letter, followed procedure, opened a channel, knowing it might lead nowhere, knowing it might change everything, and in that moment, he felt the solved case extend its reach again, not backward, but outward, influencing choices far beyond its original boundaries. At home, his family noticed the change in him, the way he listened more carefully, the way he paused before answering questions, the way he treated silence not as a gap to fill, but as something that might contain meaning. He slept a little better now, dreams less crowded, though still occasionally punctured by flashes of evidence rooms and interview tables. He didn't mind. Some cases never leave you. They shouldn't. On the anniversary of the verdict, the town held no official event.
No speeches. No ceremonies.
Instead, people gathered informally at a park, at a cafe, at kitchen tables, telling stories not about the crime, but about the years around it, contextualizing it at last, allowing it to take its place in the broader narrative rather than dominate it. The investigator attended none of these gatherings, choosing instead to walk alone that evening, tracing familiar routes, feeling the ordinary weight of the town beneath his feet. He passed the old sights, now unremarkable again, and felt a strange sense of calm settle in, the understanding that the truth had done what it needed to do. It had surfaced. It had spoken. It had changed things. Justice, he realized, isn't a moment. It's a recalibration, a slow realignment of values that continues long after the verdict is read. And in that ongoing process, the solved case served as a compass, not pointing to certainty, but to vigilance. As darkness fell, he headed home, tomorrow's work already waiting, new questions forming, new boxes unopened, and though the future held no guarantees, he felt prepared in a way he hadn't before, not because he trusted outcomes, but because he trusted the process when it was done honestly. The past would always be there. So would the truth. And now he knew exactly what it took to bring the two together. Years later, the case still surfaced in unexpected places, not as a headline or a lesson plan, but as a quiet reference point, a marker in conversations where someone lowered their voice and said, "Remember that one," as if the name alone carried gravity. The investigator heard it mentioned in hallways, in interviews, in training rooms, always with the same undertone, not admiration, not fear, but respect for what persistence had forced into the light. The ripple effects were subtle, but unmistakable. Witnesses in other cases spoke sooner. Families pushed harder. Detectives hesitated less when a detail felt wrong, even if it meant challenging senior voices or reopening assumptions that had calcified over time. The culture didn't change overnight. It never does. But it bent, just enough to let air through places that had been sealed too tight for too long. One afternoon, while reviewing a different cold case file, the investigator caught himself recognizing the same early warning signs he'd once overlooked, the same tidy narrative constructed too quickly, the same reliance on proximity and convenience over verification. He stopped, closed the file, and started again from the beginning, not trusting the summary, not trusting the conclusions, letting the raw material speak for itself. This, he realized, was the real legacy, not the verdict, not the coverage, but the permanent suspicion of certainty. The town continued to evolve. New residents arrived who had no memory of 1979, who learned about the case only in passing, as a story already resolved, stripped of its emotional immediacy. Older residents filled in the gaps when asked, sometimes carefully, sometimes clumsily, still negotiating their relationship with a past that had proven more complicated than they'd once believed. The victim's family marked milestones quietly now. Birthdays remembered differently. Anniversaries reframed. Grief had found a new rhythm, no longer driven by speculation, but by absence alone. It wasn't lighter. It was clearer. And clarity, they'd learned, was its own kind of burden. The investigator received a final message from them one winter evening, short and unadorned, thanking him not for solving the case, but for listening when no one else had. That distinction mattered more to him than any official recognition ever could. Inside the department, policies continued to shift. Evidence rooms were reorganized. Old boxes relabeled. Digital archives cross-referenced. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't generate headlines. But it was the kind of maintenance that kept truth from slipping quietly into oblivion. Occasionally, a new detective would ask him about the case directly, wanting details, wanting insight, wanting to know what the turning point had been. He always answered the same way. There wasn't one, he'd say. There were dozens. Small ones. Missed ones. Then one that wasn't. That answer frustrated some. It relieved others. The idea that justice depended not on brilliance, but on sustained attention, was both humbling and demanding. As retirement crept closer for him now, the investigator found himself thinking less about what he'd accomplished and more about what remained unfinished. The cases still unresolved, the voices still unheard. He didn't romanticize the work. He understood its limits. But he also understood its necessity. One evening, long after most of the building had emptied, he stood alone in the evidence room again, not out of habit, but reflection, the shelves stretching in neat rows, each box containing a fragment of someone's unanswered story. He didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt accountable. The solved case had taught him that time was not the enemy. Indifference was. As he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, he carried that understanding forward, not as a burden, but as a guide, aware that the work would continue without him eventually, but hoping that the mindset would remain, that somewhere, years from now, another investigator would open a box and refuse to accept the first explanation handed to them. Because the truth, he knew now, doesn't ask for brilliance. It asks for patience. It asks for courage. And it asks, above all, not to be forgotten. Retirement loomed quietly, not announced, not ceremonial, just a date circled on a calendar that the investigator tried not to look at too often, because endings, even planned ones, had a way of stirring reflection whether invited or not. The solved case lingered in his thoughts more frequently now, not because it demanded attention, but because it had become a reference point for everything that followed, a measuring stick against which all other uncertainty was unconsciously weighed. He began clearing his office in stages, slow and deliberate, sorting through years of accumulated paper, notes written in margins, diagrams that once felt urgent and now read like artifacts of a different version of himself. Each drawer told a story of questions asked, assumptions challenged, instincts trusted or ignored. He didn't rush it. This wasn't just cleanup. It was inventory. Colleagues stopped by more often, sometimes with a reason, sometimes without one, conversations drifting toward the past and then back again, circling the subject of the case without always naming it. They spoke about pressure, about doubt, about how easy it is to accept a narrative that fits neatly rather than one that demands discomfort. No one framed it as regret. It was closer to recognition. Outside the department, the world kept moving. New crimes, new crises, new distractions. The solved case receded further into history, no longer current, no longer controversial, settling into that strange category of stories everyone knows the outline of, but few remember in detail. The investigator noticed this without resentment. That was how it was supposed to be. Justice, once delivered, doesn't need constant reinforcement. It needs understanding. He met once more with a group of trainees, their faces alert, their notebooks open, waiting for something definitive, something actionable, and he surprised them by speaking not about techniques or tools, but about doubt, about the value of questioning even your own confidence, about how the most dangerous phrase in any investigation isn't "we don't know," but "we already know." He told them how close the case had come to vanishing, how many times the evidence had been nearly discarded, how many assumptions had hardened simply because no one had challenged them soon enough. He watched their expressions change, curiosity sharpening into something more serious, something heavier. This, he thought, was the real handoff. Not information, but awareness. At home, the rhythm of his days began to shift. Mornings, less rushed. Evenings, quieter. He found himself revisiting old places, not the dramatic sights tied to the crime, but ordinary ones. Streets he used to drive without noticing, corners where time had moved on without ceremony. The town felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. The case had stripped away a certain naivete, a belief that truth always announces itself clearly if you're paying attention. He understood now that truth often whispers, that it hides in details dismissed as irrelevant, that it waits for someone willing to sit with uncertainty long enough to recognize its shape. One afternoon, sorting through personal papers, he found an old notebook from the early days of the reopened investigation, pages filled with questions that had once seemed unanswerable. He read through them slowly, recognizing how many had since been resolved, how many had led nowhere, how many had only mattered because they'd been asked at all. He didn't feel pride reading them. He felt gratitude. Gratitude that the case had been given another chance. Gratitude that time, for once, had preserved what it so often destroys. As his final weeks approached, he walked through the department one last time after hours, the building quiet, lights dimmed, the familiar hum of systems running in the background. He paused at the evidence room door, not opening it, not needing to. The boxes inside were no longer just reminders of loss. They were proof of possibility. On his last day, there were handshakes, a few speeches, polite applause. He accepted it all graciously, knowing it wasn't really about him. When someone inevitably mentioned the case, framing it as his legacy, he corrected them gently. "It wasn't mine," he said. "It belonged to the truth. I just didn't walk away from it." That night, at home, the quiet felt deeper, less temporary. He sat with it, letting the years settle, letting the noise finally fade, and he thought about the victim, about the family, about the long arc from not knowing to knowing, from silence to acknowledgement. The case no longer followed him into sleep. It had done its work, but its lesson remained, steady and unyielding, a final understanding that had reshaped him more than any resolution ever could, that the past is never finished with us, that justice is fragile, and that sometimes the most important thing an investigator can do is simply refuse to accept that a story has ended when it hasn't. In retirement, the days unfolded with a different texture, slower, less defined by urgency, yet never empty, because the mind doesn't abandon its patterns simply because the calendar changes. The investigator found himself waking early out of habit, listening to the quiet before the town stirred, a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed, and in those moments, the case would surface again, not as a problem to solve, but as a memory to be understood. People recognized him occasionally, in grocery stores, on sidewalks, their acknowledgement brief, respectful, as if unsure whether to thank him or leave him alone. He appreciated the restraint. The story, after all, was no longer his to narrate. It had become communal, absorbed into the town's collective memory, reshaped by time and distance. He stayed in touch with a few colleagues, meeting for coffee, conversations drifting between ordinary life and professional reflection, and inevitably, the case returned, not with urgency, but with curiosity, as something they could finally discuss without the pressure of outcome. They spoke about what they would do differently now, about how much had changed and how much hadn't. What struck him most was how often they circled back to the same point, how easily certainty had been accepted the first time. Not out of malice, out of convenience. It was easier to believe the story that fit than to sit with the discomfort of ambiguity. He volunteered occasionally, guest lectures at local colleges, community discussions about cold cases, about memory, about the intersection of science and patience, and he was careful in those settings, not to dramatize, not to sensationalize, but to ground the conversation in responsibility. Each time, someone asked the same question in a different way. How did you know when to reopen it? And each time, his answer was consistent. I didn't, he said. I just knew it didn't feel finished. That unsettled some people, comforted others. It was the closest he could come to honesty. The victim's family reached out less often now, not because gratitude had faded, but because life had finally expanded beyond the shadow of the case. When they did speak, it was with a warmth that felt genuine, unburdened by expectation. They talked about plans, about the future, about ordinary things that had once felt unreachable. The investigator found peace in that more than in any public acknowledgement. It meant the case had stopped consuming them. It had taken its proper place among many defining moments rather than standing alone as the only one. He spent more time reading, writing notes not for reports, but for himself, reflections on what the work had taught him, on how easily institutions confuse tradition with truth, on how silence can masquerade as stability. He never intended to publish them. They were anchors, reminders of why the work had mattered. One evening, watching the sun set over the town, he realized something that had eluded him for years. The case hadn't been about catching someone. It had been about listening. Listening to what the evidence said instead of what people wanted it to say. Listening to those who had been ignored because their voices complicated the narrative. Listening to doubt. Justice, he understood now, wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was an accumulation of attention, applied consistently over time. As seasons passed, the case drifted further into history, no longer referenced with urgency, no longer capable of reopening wounds the way it once had. It had been integrated, absorbed, and that, he believed, was its final resolution. On a quiet night, he walked past the courthouse, lights off, windows dark, the building resting from its role as arbiter, and he felt a strange gratitude for the delay, for the long road, for the years that had made the truth impossible to ignore. Had it been solved earlier, it might not have been understood. The past doesn't reveal itself all at once. It waits until we're ready to hear it. And as the investigator turned homeward, content in a way he'd never expected, he carried that understanding with him, confident that even when stories fall silent, their lessons remain, shaping choices long after the final verdict fades from memory. Part 15. The final understanding arrived not as a revelation, but as a settling, the kind that comes only after years of motion finally slow enough to let meaning catch up. The investigator no longer measured time by cases or deadlines, but by mornings and evenings, by the quiet persistence of ordinary days, and yet the past remained present, not intrusive, not demanding, simply there, woven into how he saw the world. Sometimes, late at night, he replayed moments from the investigation, not searching for alternatives, not second-guessing decisions, but observing them with a distance that only time allows, recognizing patterns he couldn't have named then, the subtle choreography between chance and choice, between hesitation and resolve. He understood now that the case had not been exceptional because it was solved, but because it had been allowed to wait until the truth could no longer be ignored. The town moved on fully. New families arrived. Old houses changed hands. Children grew up hearing the story as history rather than memory, and with that shift came something rare, perspective. The case was no longer a wound or a controversy. It was a lesson, imperfect but intact, a reminder passed quietly between generations that certainty should be earned, not inherited. He encountered the victim's name occasionally, in archives, in local projects, sometimes spoken aloud in discussions about justice and reform, and each time it felt right, grounded, no longer tethered exclusively to violence, but to the long arc of accountability that followed. The person had not been reduced to the crime. Their story had expanded beyond it. In moments of solitude, the investigator returned to a single thought again and again, one that had crystallized only after everything else had quieted. The most dangerous cases are not the ones without evidence. They're the ones with answers that arrive too early, answers that satisfy enough to stop the questions before they've done their work. He wrote this down once, then closed the notebook, not because it was complete, but because it was enough. There were no more calls about the case. No more requests for comment. No more need to explain how it had happened. The story had found its place, and with it, he had found his own, no longer defined by pursuit, but by understanding. On an ordinary afternoon, he walked through the town one last time, not as an investigator, not as a symbol, just as someone who had lived there long enough to know its rhythms. The streets were unremarkable again. The air carried nothing but weather. And that, more than anything, felt like resolution. The case had begun with silence. It had ended with truth. Between those 2 points lay years of waiting, of doubt, of resistance, of courage that never announced itself loudly enough to be recognized in the moment. But in hindsight, it was all there, steady and unbroken, the slow work of refusing to let a story end before it was ready. As evening fell, the investigator headed home, the day complete, the past at rest, aware that justice does not always arrive on time, but when it does, it leaves behind something enduring, not answers, but vigilance, a quiet insistence that no matter how long it takes, truth remains possible for those willing to keep listening. And with that, the story finally settled, not closed, not forgotten, but complete in the only way it ever could be, by being understood at last. Pennsylvania 1979 cold case solved. Investigators uncover stunning secret.